Um, Let me begin by welcoming you all to this panel discussion on Quentin Tarantino's The Django Unchained. Not sure how many of you were in the audience last night, but we had a fairly huge audience, a very large audience last night in Solomon. If you were there, I'd like to thank you again for coming. If you were there last night, you know that the movie went on for quite a bit, almost 3 hours, which meant that it really was not possible for us to have a panel discussion, even though it would have been nice to have it right after. But my understanding is that people began to leave towards the end, and correctly so. They were, sitting down you're not in a cinema house, Solomon. So people were beginning to get antsy. That people have exams and so on and so on and so forth. So we thought that what we would do is do this in 2 parts. One part we would review the movie, which we did last night, and then today we will do the panel discussion. So I'd like to welcome you for coming. C.L.R. James once said in writing about the novel that once the novel gets to a certain point where everybody is discussing it and where lots of people have bought it, he says the novel then leaves the realm of the literary and then becomes something else. And he doesn't necessarily describe what that something else is. But I think what he is trying to say is that once artistic and literary products, if you wish, get taken up in a certain way, then they can not only now be discussed either as cinematic or literary or art products, but they have to be discussed, if you wish, with some kind of context and some kind of gesture, if you wish, towards the social. It would seem to me that this particular movie, Django Unchained, falls in that category. It's not a question whether it's great or not great. Brilliant cinematography or anything, or direction or anything. Those are aesthetic questions or questions that people can raise or discuss. But it seems to me that the controversy and the discussions that the movie has generated really takes it out of the realm of just a movie. And so that we really need to begin to try and understand what it is that has happened. Why this movie, along with Lincoln, which is a separate one, generated this amount of discussion. James himself talks about the things becoming social when this kind of controversy is created. But I would want to argue that when controversy is created, that there are certain things that it represents. One, that they tend to represent unresolved questions in a society, questions that people are either swept out of the carpet or questions that we have not resolved. And that when that happens, then the actual movie becomes, if you wish, almost like a placeholder for a set of discussions that need to happen, but which have never happened or not happening for some reason. In this case, therefore, I would want to suggest that the Django is perhaps, quote-unquote, a kind of placeholder for discussions and debates in this country about race and slavery. 2 things which are never, I think, discussed in any full way in this country. That there's always a set of way in which we gesture to a discussion, but the full discussion we just don't seem to be able to get to. And part of that is that perhaps that the business of racial slavery and its history and legacies in this country is yet unfinished business. So that therefore to discuss questions of race and slavery is actually to discuss the present and the unfinished business of the present, the legacies, the traces of race and slavery in the present social structures that we have. So that is one of the reasons why we thought that we would bring this here. Not because we thought it was a great movie, anything like that. But that we thought that it was a movie that represented a kind of placeholder for a set of discussions that needed to happen. And since we were the Center for Slavery and Justice, then we thought that it was appropriate for us to bring this here. We tried to get it very early, actually. When it first came out, it was actually a suggestion by the research assistant, Elon, he was sitting right here. But we should bring it, and then we tried to get it, and they said no. It was a funny discussion. The distributor said to us, if it is a hit, you can't get it till April. If it's not a hit, you can get it anytime you want. So obviously it was a hit, so as soon as April came, we said to them, or March came, we said, it's a hit, so obviously can we get it, and we got it and screen it, and decided to screen it today. What are some of the comments, if you wish, that have happened around the movie? Perhaps one of the most important comments, or one of the first comments, but if not the most important comment, was the comment of Spike Lee, a preeminent black filmmaker. She's got to have it on all the other things that he has done. And who made a point that he's not seeing this movie because he's sure that it will disrespect, he says, quote unquote, my ancestors. Ishmael Reed, very important literary and cultural figure in the African American culture and literacy. After he saw the movie, says, to compare this movie to a spaghetti western and black exploitation is an insult to both genres. So you got some very harsh comments there. Dick Gregory, some of you know or might not know, long-standing comic and civil rights activist in the African American community, had a different reaction. He says, I never saw any black man kill a white man on the screen yet, or any slave holder on the screen. Therefore, I like the, paraphrasing it, I like the movie. And he made particular reference to the final scenes of Django when Jamie Foxx wasted, if you wish, the plantation owners and other people. And then there have been comments from various people who have argued about the ways in which it is a revenge movie, like every other Western, spaghetti Western in many ways, but that it actually is a revenge movie in which the black women are protected. And the question of the black woman, I think, has been very central to the discussion. But what I find interesting is a set of comments by black feminists who make the point that, yes, it is true the black woman is protected, and here is a black man protecting a black woman, and so on. And that's never seen that on the screen. But what happens in the movie is that this kind of protection and this kind of figure of the Django really minimizes the collective ways in which black struggle is supposed to be carried out, and the collective responsibility, in particularly of black women and black men in a certain kind of struggle, and just makes it a single figure that has to do with a personal kind of story. So that there are all these comments, and it's swirling. People are on whatever side of the fences that they are, they find themselves. I know that when the movie came out, that certainly with some folks that I know, friends, it burnt up the telephone and the email for about a week, and then it subsided, right? But what was to me was fascinating was that we got quite a number of people last night. And what is also fascinating to me is quite frankly, is the many liberals, white liberals who I know, who come to me and say, I've seen Django, as kind of hopefully a sign that that they have seen a particular movie in which white folks, particularly slaves, get killed. So there are all these things that are kind of going around. So we thought that we would try and have a discussion around it, that and with different perspectives from different scholars who are thinking about this. The format essentially will be people will have about 15-20 minutes. They can take less, they can't really take more. And then they can have a discussion amongst themselves, and then we can have a discussion, a back and forth Q&A with the audience. And I think, we should aim to get out of here about 8:30, quarter to 9, thereabouts. All right, so let me just introduce very quickly the three panelists, and also just say something about, just to say who I am. I tend to forget to call my name. I'm Tony Bowles, Professor of Africana Studies and the Director of the Center for Slavery and Justice. I tend to forget that on this, so that's who I am. So let me just say something quickly about the three panelists. To my left is Professor Terry Francis, who is Associate Professor of Film Studies and African American Studies at Yale University. And I want to thank her very much for coming to this. When we were searching at the center for a younger scholar, I can say that kind of way, right? A younger scholar who would have, we think would have something to say. Her name kept on popping up in discussions with people. And so I got in touch with her, writing her first name right, but her last name wrong. Because there was another Terry at Yale, and then had to immediately apologize, but she was very gracious about it and decided to come. So I want to thank her very, very much for coming. I know of her work. I've heard her present at University of Pittsburgh about 2 years ago, thereabouts, when we were together at a conference on colonial film. So welcome to Berlin. And she will go first. The second person, the person beside her, is Professor Matthew Guttrell, who is just been here, I think he's not quite a year yet, Matt, right?
Not quite a year.
Not quite a year yet. And I was saying to him how he looks a little tired now, so. Professor Guttrell is an appointment in Africana Studies and American Studies. He's actually writing a book on Josephine Baker, which I heard about recently when he came here to give a talk a couple of months ago. And he's also a member of the advisory committee, the faculty advisory committee of the Slavery and Justice Center. And I want to thank him because when I asked him, there was absolutely no hesitation at all on his part to do this. And then the final panelist is Professor Corey Walker, who is the chair of Africana Studies, who many of you in this room would know is really an extraordinary figure in the younger scholar again in the field of Africana Studies, working on questions of critical theory and of religion in particular, and was also proven over the last year to be a very, very able administrator and chair of the Department of Africana Studies. And again, when I asked him, we had to have a discussion about this because he wasn't quite sure what the purpose was. But then he said, this is we need to have a discussion around this, and so why don't you join us? And he said, okay. So I want to thank all three of them for coming, and to thank you as well. So without further ado, let me turn the chair over to Tim.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. You have to greet people. I'm really excited to be here, and this is actually my first opportunity to talk about Django Unchained in public. I've been talking about it amongst my friends. Actually, before it came out, we were basically salivating, waiting for this picture to come out, and then had a lot to say, after it did. I actually was going to start with the idea of it's just a movie, but in a really different way from the way that the way that my colleague Tony evoked it, because it's actually Django Unchained's fictionality and its unreality, right? It's fantastical dimensions that are of interest to me. But it is the case that a film's fictionality is usually only evoked or recognized in order to dismiss it, as it's just a movie. But this tension between reality and unreality is the film's actual site of instruction. We all, recall, it's horrible teaching, in high school where the teacher shows you a movie to get you to connect with a certain historical period or with an historical figure. And of course, this is deeply problematic, right? Because it's a fictional representation, and we do have documentaries. Documentaries are films that have ethical obligations to represent reality in ways that the filmmakers, will be accountable for. And fictional filmmakers are sometimes held to that same ethical standard, although there are a variety of ways in which they reference reality. Like Spike Lee, of course, is very much grounded in the current events around any film that he makes, but it's a source. So like the film will begin with, like Malcolm X, for example, begins, not with an explicit scene of Malcolm X or from his era, but from the then contemporary of 1992, 91 rather, the Rodney King beating. It begins with that video, and then moves backwards to the 40s, and then forward after that, and then it ends again in the present day. So there's an elasticity to the way that he, represents the reality of Malcolm X, and so it's a problematic and an interesting question, this relationship between film and history, because sometimes it makes the past intelligible, and sometimes it obscures the past. Sometimes it can bring us more, like this constructed world can bring us into a closer contact with our own time in productive ways, and and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just really complicated. The other part of it, is that forgotten films are constantly being unearthed. I'm just thinking about, film as a kind of reservoir of memory. That we haven't seen all the films that there have been in the past. Just this weekend I saw a film called Sidewalk Stories, 1989. It came out the same year as Do the Right Thing. And it's a completely different planet from Do the Right Thing, and yet African American film history is basically kind of organized around Do the Right Thing, right? That's how we go back to the 80s. That's how we go back or get into African American cinema and what it means. And yet there's this other like silent Charlie Chaplin-esque, adorable and tender film, black and white, that was also made at that time, but that didn't have the same infrastructure around it. And so there's, so our access to the past through film is really uneven, right? And that's something that I think we have to keep in mind. And then when these films come back to us, they come back not as a stable artifact, right? But they come back as new and old at the same time. In the same way that something like Django Unchained, it's kind of about the past, but it's really about us right now. I think that because it's just a movie, we have to pay attention to the ways in which the film not only gestures to a lived past, but the way that it doesn't do that. Right, the titles at the beginning, the year is 1860 or something like that, 3 years before the Civil War, somewhere in Texas. I mean, that's kind of vague. And so it's not a film that's trying to be staked in actual history. It's kind of a very broad, vague sense of history, but it's a gesture that's, I guess, supposed to be, grounding in some way. But then it moves on from that to address a lot of different a lot of different times. So the paradox, I think, of film and history, so when I started thinking about this film, I just kind of went back to sort of how do I think about film and history in general, is that, for history or for the past to actually become history and to become meaningful, we have to be able to imagine it. We have to be able to make the leap from where we are right now to this other time that we didn't live in and maybe don't know anyone, or and if you're not an actual historian, you're not engaging the document, so it's a leap. But at the same time, imagination is clearly the enemy to historical accuracy, because I know, for me as an historian, I cannot make things up. I have to talk about Josephine Baker or whatever I write about in exactly the way that she's represented in the text, right? I can't just vibe with it. I have certain disciplinary responsibilities. Although I have to go there and put it into order and everything. So it's a can't stay, can't go, kind of situation. But it's true, as you say, the film is a kind of placeholder, right? And it does become this forum for reflection, and that's kind of the exciting part. But in the way that it's just a movie, I really think that this is not a bad thing, because the fact that it's just a movie we don't have to believe it. You get into it, you look at it, you walk around it, you feel whatever you feel and have conversations and move on. I think the pressure is that we're not really all that historically informed. The film touches on a hurricane of emotions, of lacunae in all of our sort of sense of this past and how it impacts the present. And so it's really hard to be rational, I think, about a film like this. And as I was saying earlier, I was like, this film is a carnival. I mean, it's just absurd. This German person comes in out of nowhere. And as I was looking at it again last night, it's almost literally like the film is going on and it's one kind of film, and then he walks into it and is always this kind of outside character looking in. And that, we may not be prepared to engage this particular period, through a lens of absurdity, but there it is. I always kind of hope that as spectators we can, be skeptical of the things that we see on screen and see them for what they are, and then move on. But then at the same time, we don't want to, in any way demean the seriousness with which, we need to engage all of these emotions that are evoked, by this type of work. I feel like it's almost like a Kara Walker moment, of just someone, she's making films now, and I just saw one of them, and it's really terrifying to see her silhouettes in motion doing things. And there are these puppets, and you can see the puppeteer, and the whole thing is just very nightmarish. But what else is slavery? I mean, it wasn't a pageant, was it? It was horrifying. And so how else to return to it except through representations of horror? So I guess in trying to figure it out, I actually thought about 4 different films I'm just going to mention really quickly. And then we can talk about it if you're interested, and if you guys want to talk about them too. And I have a brief clip, which I have to show, because let me tell you, it took me 3 hours to get this 59-second clip. And so I'm going to show this clip. It's like I was an English major. You open the book, you make the mark, you got it. And this film thing is nothing like that. It's really annoying. So the first film that came to my mind actually was Sweetback's Badass Song. And Sweetback and Django, I think, have a lot, not that they talk much, but I think they have a lot to say to each other. And the other guy that should be in that conversation is Ivan from The Harder They Come, who...
Can you repeat the name of the film?
Sweetback's Badass Song.
Thank you.
2 A's, 4 S's. And The Harder They Come, just a Jamaican film from the 70s. And, in those 2 films, The Harder They Come and Sweetback's Badass Song, are deeply engaged, with each other. And those directors knew each other and had conversations, about film and about filmmaking. And then finally, I guess I said 4. Anyway, so the third one, and they're all for different reasons, is actually Spike Lee's film Girl 6. I don't know if you've seen this film. A lot of people try to avoid it, but it's very watchable and very interesting, with a screenplay by Susan Laurie Parks. And guess who is in it? QT, playing a character named QT. And he is a hot Hollywood director. This is 1996. So he plays a hot Hollywood director who is auditioning Girl 6, who's auditioning this African-American woman. And she's doing the monologue for She's Gotta Have It, which is a whole other thing. But then he says to her, you know, look, I'm going to direct the greatest African-American romance ever. And so that just came rushing back to me. You know, as Spike Lee and Quentin Tarantino in their own way, you know, duked it out. And so, you know, he's so frustrating to talk about, Quentin Tarantino is, but there's something there, and in a way, he has become America's black filmmaker, which can't be anything but distressing to the actual American black filmmaker, Spike Lee. So so this is all by way of saying that in thinking about film and history, I guess I think more about films than history. It's super uncomfortable to begin to talk about this film that way in the context of slavery and justice, of course. But you know, but those are the tools that that I have to bring to the discussion. So the clip I'm going to show you is the last. Maybe I'll do less than 59 because I'm sure I've been talking for too long. Yeah. The last few seconds of the film, which I think directly promise us Django Unchained, and for better or for worse. And then I have all kinds of things to say about Jamie Foxx and the way that comedians really have something very special that they bring to what they do. The eros, the pathos, and the physicality, like everything is really unique. I mean, Denzel could never be Django. He cannot do that. Will Smith cannot be Django Unchained. He can't do that. They're too dignified. So let me show this clip, and then you'll see what I mean. And then we'll move on. I'm sorry though. I should have walked around the other way. Sorry about that.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Weinberg.
So I don't know how many of you have seen this film, but Sweetback is a hustler who sort of becomes politicized. It's deeply problematic. It's a problematic, movie, as they are. But in this part of the film, he's on the run from some cops, and he is trying to escape by crossing the border into Mexico. This is all set in LA, and he's been through a series of kind of scenes of have you seen him, and he's kind of dodging this, but it's kind of a portrait of community in a way, even though it's so, it's not the most loving film ever, so I'm not saying that, but you know how things are, it's always, the opposite is always there. So in this moment, it's like the end of the chase, so it's the height of the moment. So I'm just gonna get rid of. And we see, what you're going to see, disturbing images of animals that have been attacked by Sweetback, and then we move on. So and then I'm showing it without sound as well. So of course it kind of surveys the damage he's done. This is supposed to establish him as the lone hero in the wilderness, battling the elements. These are the dogs that were sent after him. And then this is more or less his perspective too. and that's our man. And he turns around and he's basically Django Unchained. That's kind of how I read the performance. I guess I could stop there. Let's stop with this type of question on the film. And the other thing I should say probably too is that Suits Feedback is credited with, I guess, laying the template for the blaxploitation era type of films. And it does draw a lot on the Western and trying to create this lone silent hero, that all those films had, but in an urban setting, kind of like The Harder They Come as well, which came out just 2 years later. So they are kind of involved, and it begins with absurd performance. Sexual performance, just very, it's in that sort of those lower frequencies. The lower frequencies of blackness, definitely not the dignified blackness. But it's, it seems to me to be part of the conversation on this movie and a good way to, get into it. I think I should stop there.
No, thank you.
All right.
Matthew?
I wish I had something as well formed as that to say. This movie I am still very much in process thinking about this movie. That I've seen it a couple of times. I've seen it in a movie theater, in a mixed audience late at night when the darkness of the theater is meant to envelop you and convince you that the film should be taken on its own terms. And I've seen it in the bright of day with the volume turned half down, with little kids running around in front of me, volume way down. So, but when Tony asked me originally to be a part of this, I had an idea of what I wanted to say, and I had expressed it elsewhere. But when I sat down to think today, literally, about what I might say, the best I could do was to come up with a top 10 list. Top 10 reasons why I think this film irritates me on some level. And by irritate, I don't just mean that I want to set it aside and walk away from it. I mean that it provokes a reaction from me that I think needs to be explored. And for me, the first process of exploring it is to catalog the list of provocations, to really think about where it's getting me, at what level, what precisely is going on. Some of it is abstract, and some of it is very specific, right? And some of it is just rooted in my particular self watching this film, and some of it is me as a historian, too. In particular, a historian who's written about slavery, who's written about slaveholders in particular, encountering this film and watching Calvin Candy. But my initial reaction to the film, I have to admit, having seen it here at the lovely Providence Place Cinema, was I was irked before I even set foot in the place, because for whatever reason I cannot get myself behind Quentin Tarantino, and I had spent a week reading all of this terrible stuff, chiefly from Spike Lee, but from others and people encapsulating Quentin Tarantino's own racial philosophy, such as it is, his own sense of how precisely the N-word can be used, his own sense that he was in another life a black man, his own sense, as Spike Lee famously expressed, that if he uses the N-word enough, he might become an honorary black man in this particular generation. His wish that he might be seen as one of the greatest black filmmakers, that he could be for us what Bill Clinton was for Toni Morrison. And I want to admit before I say more that I did walk into that first viewing completely and totally dismayed by what I thought I would encounter, and really ready to hate the movie and to not enjoy it at all. And as much as I want to be objective, right, and as much as I believe that this is an important film that we must talk about over and over again, I have to say that if the intent was to create a carnival that was provocative, he was enormously successful, because I left really provoked and agitated with a lot to say and a lot to think about. And I think some filmmakers want to be that kind of agitator, and he is enormously successful and very good at his job. an extremely irritating person. He makes, I think, very irritating and very important films precisely because they're irritating. So, top 10 lists in all sorts of different orders. Things that make me tight about this particular film. The first and foremost is Quentin Tarantino himself, and in fact, almost all of this, the structure of the film, the way it's laid out, the cinematography, its derivative qualities, it's the particular characters that he uses. I find them all so perfectly expressive of his approach to filmmaking and his personal philosophy, and that has driven me nuts since I first encountered Quentin Tarantino as a filmmaker. So I see this as of a piece, in particular of a piece with the Grindhouse films, and of a piece with Inglourious Bastards, and with his lifelong fascination with blood and gore and fanboys and discrete references that only 500 people understand, situated and sprinkled throughout the film. So I find him irritating, and I find his filmmaking structure to be jarring and disjointing. It wakes the viewer up. It makes you constantly alert to the director's presence. It's not seductive in the way that contemporary filmmaking can be at times. It really is meant to foreground at very particular moments his self-styled or self-appointed genius. I feel like I wish I could look to see what your face is when I'm saying this.
Oh, I'm smiling. You get acceptance and
I found as well that the film irked me for its camp. And of all things, having written a book on Southern slaveholders and slavery in particular, a book which I found to be one of the most melancholy and difficult experiences as a writer, I found that his use of camp in the film was politically disturbing and troubling. Camp signaled by the wobbling tooth on top of the stagecoach, camp signaled by the sunglasses, camp signaled by the strange costume, both of Django, camp signaled by the blinged out horse saddle that Django rides, camp signaled in a number of ways that I found, camp signaled by stunt casting as well, by Don Johnson and Bruce Dern, who really should have better things to do with their lives right now than to be stunt cast in a film about slavery and slaveholding. I also found myself irked because there was a moment in the film, that dinner table scene that goes on for 20 minutes, which is perhaps, the most extraordinary 20 minutes of any film Quentin Tarantino has ever directed. I thought it was a flawlessly executed, moving. I thought the central characters were really gripping and amazing, and I found, even in the bright light of day, that it was a difficult scene to look away from. It was so amazingly performed, and it only reveals that he can do better than when, at the end of the film, he has Django rear his horse up and do a little fancy ponies trot before he skips off, which I found, again, campy and annoying. I found that my strongest opinions, though, were about the way the institution of slavery is represented. And I was stressed out, as I think many historians were, by the sort of garish, carnivalesque representation of slavery, the mandingo fighting, the use of garish neck chains and head barbs, the presence of a black slave trader, the death by dog, the presence of phrenology, which, though a part of Southern slaveholding, was a very obscure discourse in this particular period of time. And though those things were certainly an aspect of American slaveholding practice and slaveholding practice in general, there was significantly more to slaveholding than these spectacular demonstrations of violence and barbarity. And to a certain extent, the institution of slavery was marked as well by quotidian aggressions from the slaveholding class, by micro power struggles over the day-to-day. And those are buried and hidden in the film. They make it possible for the spectacular presence of slavery in the film means that the only possible response can be spectacular resistance. It's the reason why Django has to do what Django does. The dinner table scene is for me, a perfect example of this, that the smaller struggles buried within the institution of slavery were always about little things like tines on forks getting broken or bread that gets dropped and then mischievously gets placed on the table. The little pushback against the slaveholding class to match the big pushback that would occasionally appear. But the dinner service is immaculate, and there is very little slave resistance in the film at all that we see, but for that of Django. There are references to resistance off screen, but those who do resist are punished to the death. They have no real, they're either buried in a hot box and left to bake in the sun or eaten by dogs. Only Django, with his kind of spectacular mode of resistance, is capable of pushing back against the slavery that Tarantino describes only in the most carnivalesque, cartoonish terms. And I thought as well that the representation of Django as this kind of extension of Sweetback is of a man whose motivations here, though they are clearly rooted in the spaghetti western genre, are also almost entirely selfish. It's astonishing to me how his pushback here against this institution isn't against the institution at all. It's to recover his loved one and to make his way back into the world. There's no effort to foment resistance, no effort to create the circumstances for a larger change. And I'm not entirely certain why you would make a movie that engages with slavery symbolically and in the broadest brushstrokes, but then not feel that you had the liberty to push back historically against what slave resistance might have looked like. Why make resistance so selfish, self-centered, so solipsistic as you do through Django? I also have to say that the historical inaccuracies for myself, I don't think I didn't get entirely motivated by these to dismiss the film, but I do think it's important when you're dealing with some particular issues, and slavery is one of those issues where you have an ethical and moral, if you're making a historical claim about a moment in time, I think it's important to be ethically and morally sound in the way that you describe the institution itself. So this isn't just about what I've iterated now already, this bigger picture of slavery being so garish and cartoonish, but also about the minor inaccuracies, the date at which the Civil War began, the presence of sunglasses, of all things, the strange arrival of Australian miners in the deep Southwest, including Quentin Tarantino, that again I think are moments at which you're supposed to wake up and recognize this for a Quentin Tarantino production and stand back and enjoy the fact that this is one of those. But I also just think that there's really no need to include them when making a film about Southern slaveholding, in particular and about slave resistance, and that they entirely distract from what could be a rich and provocative conversation about the film's politics and its contemporary significance. Having said all of this, and having recognized or admitted what a difficult thing it was to watch the film multiple times and to articulate for myself the many ways in which the film agitated me, I do think it has a really important role in our present conversations about race. I think it has a role to play in our conversations about the ways in which filmmakers, casting directors, actors, and audiences feel flip about subjects that were once toxic, or that you could only once talk about very carefully. That there is for Quentin Tarantino, drunk and swollen at the Academy Awards, wearing a leather suit and tie, a kind of disregard both for the industry, the audience, and for the seriousness of the topic he's addressing in the film. But I do think, again, that it's something we should talk about, knowing the Brown students as well as I do, and knowing that you're all here on a Tuesday night when it's 70 degrees outside and sunny. I suspect that many of you have things to say as well. So part of what I want to do is get out of the way, having said all this, and pass the baton to my colleague Corey, and sit back and hear what he has to say, and then get ready for the audience discussion and for our discussion.
Let me thank Professor Bogues for the invitation, and Terry, this is the first time I met you, and Matt, good friend. Where should I begin? First of all, the film was boring, dry, dumb. I didn't like it. All right, that's it. Aesthetically, it's uninteresting. The most aesthetically interesting scene was the dinner scene, where you actually get gesture, you actually get technique, and you actually get good cinematography and good choreography. As I talked with Professor Bogues about this, to begin to talk about Django Unchained as a commentary on race, or larger political commentary on America, is actually to feed into the cycle of the decadence of the elite academy around when we talk about race. What we're really talking about are black people and the white imagination. So if we're going to talk about the white imagination, let's take the title of the 1981 book, Cowboys and Europeans, which is the definitive study of spaghetti westerns, and take that as the mode of discourse. And then we're going to talk about Django and the white imagination. And that would be a good point of entry. However, that still doesn't seem as the way in which we can begin to have a profitable conversation about this movie. If we're going to talk about slavery and chattel slavery in the U.S., this isn't the film. So let's not, the problem that we would encounter is actually a problem of misplaced priorities, or a problem of how we begin to value film. And film and history, they're not quite different. They are of the same genre when we're talking about trying to arrest the imagination, which is the project of the Enlightenment since European modernity, and of course Kant's famous three famous critiques. So that can't be the case. So the case is a media phenomenon. There is a media discussion around a film where the filmmaker explicitly stated that this is a film to make money. I'm fine with that. Make the money you want. But the reality of it is, there's always the title of Greg Tate's wonderful edited collection that's ode to Florence Tate, Everything But the Burden. And in many ways, once again, black people have been used to make money and to exploit and to serve as the occasion for conversation and to soothe the psyche of a dominant white society. And if we want to actually suspend the filmmaker's aesthetic strategies, techniques, and provocations with film, then we are complicit in that particular project. If you remember, the German that enters the film is also the German that's in Inglourious Basterds. And there's the famous scene in Inglourious Basterds, and in that film where he's sitting down talking to the operator of the theater at the moment where they're about to have a screening for Adolf Hitler to come in. And of course there's a black man who's the film operator, and he's trying to convince the film this white woman who he killed her family as a child. Now he's coming back and she remembers him. But he has this preoccupation with the Negro that's a film operator, and that person has to go. These are two same actors, and in many ways, this is Quentin Tarantino. This is Quentin Tarantino as the white Negro of 1957. This is Quentin Tarantino as William Styron, Nat Turner, when Styron, as early as 1951, wants to get into the mind of Nat Turner. And then, of course, in 1967, he writes Nat Turner as if he can actually go into the mind of the Negro slave. So this becomes part of that genre. So if we actually begin to baptize it into another genre, we begin a categorical era. In as much as this film is about Quentin Tarantino, it is also a film about contemporary media culture in the U.S. Anything that is quote unquote provocative all of a sudden becomes a topic of conversation, a necessity for us to engage. The idea that this then becomes a topic for serious scholarly debate and discourse. Now, if this were a conversation purely about Django Unchained and not to historical analogs, which would actually be extremely problematic, as both of my colleagues have stated, then it would be a different conversation. But we're attempting to gesture towards an outside of the film that the film refuses an outside. I mean, and part of it is the very beauty of the film, the actual refusal of the outside. But in the actual commercialization of the film, you have to gesture to an outside. So it's not just a film that inhabits the absurdity. It is a film that necessitates a virtual absurdity that is reality. And in many ways, that's what we don't want to face. So we can't just inhabit the film. No film, no novel. I mean, this is what the Jamesian quote about the novel. Nothing enters into the world in tabula rasa or in absolute form. It is always contextual. So if we're going to then think contextually, then let's have a discussion about the particular context, and let's not have a pretense about a particular form that enters the world as if we're dealing with some platonic world. Let's clear it now. We got all that clear. Let's talk about Django. The most interesting character in Django probably was the character played by Samuel L. Jackson, as my dear colleague Charlie Cobb reminded me. And yeah, I mean, that's absolute beauty. I mean, it is character development, it is depth. This is probably the most important character in the film because we actually get the inner thinkings of the character. Because the cinematography of that dinner scene actually demonstrates that this character is thinking. So at the moment where he's looking around the table, you actually get a portrait of the interior life of that character. Because there's a moment where the camera actually goes to Samuel L. Jackson's character, and then you're drawn into the process because his eyes begin to move. And he's not speaking, but now we get to see his eyes. So the real star of the film becomes Samuel L. Jackson and not Jamie Foxx, because Jamie Foxx is almost a stock character. I mean, he's sort of this character that's sitting there as just this figure for the German character, and I'm blanking on his name right now. So you're really not interested in Django qua Django. I mean, you're only interested in Django as this particular person that's actually doing something. You're more interested in the action that emanates from this stock figure. But with the Samuel L. Jackson character, now we have some interest because then he acts on this certain unseen knowledge or unacknowledged knowledge around that particular dinner table. So now that becomes interesting. So we're drawn into this character. And we see him, we see gesture and technique. We're introduced to the character not through his face, which we only find at the end of the house, but actually through him acting as the master. First, it is the role on this particular stamp. So we see gesture and technique here. And this becomes quite interesting. So if I were a film scholar, I'm trying to figure out who shot the scenes there and how was the edit made. And why did we edit it that way? And then what were those aesthetic decisions to do that? Because now we're drawn into that character as a full-fledged person. So I'm very interested in that character aesthetically and as a film strategy. Now, to try to make this out to be, I mean, the problematic political dimension of this is that Django saves his death for lies. So all of the intense competition in the film is never between black and white, because that's always happens at a distance. It's always the most intimate enemy. It is always the distance between Django as a black slaver and the house slave played by Samuel L. Jackson, or Django, who is performing a particular part or role going to Candyland, and the way in which he responds to those Mandingos who are going to fight. So the politics becomes quite interesting, because then, of course, the white male as director gets the stage, black on black aggression, black on black anger, black on black destruction. And white destruction becomes almost incidental, or white destruction becomes always individual. And of course it becomes, you also have the moment where everything is always mediated through the white character. Even Django's freedom is always mediated. And the line in the script, which I would love to, talk to the screenwriter and say, I've never given anyone their freedom. So Django never frees himself. He's not a revolutionary. He is given his freedom. Now, these are just sort of, you're looking at a film, and my dear colleague, I didn't know we had AV here, but Greg Tate, who couldn't be here, sent a clip of Oklahoma Cowboys here to begin to think through that these Oklahoma the idea of black cowboys and Buffalo Soldier with Bob Marley. This isn't anything new, but in 2013 this may be something new. So there's a beautiful black and white film that he just sent me a clip of that we could show. Or Kevin Everson, the filmmaker, went down to that I work with, went down to Louisiana to actually begin to do a film on Louisiana cowboys. And I thought back and forth, maybe we should show clips of that, but then that would actually give more credit to the film, except the film is really a film about making money. And if this is a film for Hollywood, and of course Hollywood always has to gesture to something else, it's almost like a derivative, right? This is what Wall Street does, derives its values from something else, collateralized debt obligations. This becomes the exemplary moment of neoliberal capitalism. And this is what Django is. It is the exemplary moment of our capitalist society. And I want to just leave it at that, and we can have a good conversation. Thank you.
Okay, the floor is open for discussion, Q&A.
Okay, I'll say something. QT is a little bit like P.T. Barnum. He's a circus barker. And, I don't go to the circus to learn how to interact with tigers. It's not going to teach me anything about that. It's something else. And popular culture is capital driven. It is there to make money. Kevin Everson is a totally different kind of filmmaker, as is Khalil Joseph. I think you're talking about. I just saw that film today. Actually, it is very beautiful, and it's only 3 minutes. We can show it.
Oh.
It's not very long. But they're just. I don't know. I think it's just important that they're different. They are in conversation with each other, and they belong in conversation with each other. And I think Kevin would be the first one to kind of engage that, because part of the way that popular culture is, and it doesn't have to be accepted or agreed with, although, I don't think we have to agree with it to kind of see it for what it is and what it's always been. We've always been going to hell in a handbasket. Popular culture has always been depraved and vile and concerned with scandal and skin and just kind of horrific things and kind of gross things, right? It's never been this kind of high-minded thing. I think it's probably accidental if something, productive in that, in the way that you mean by like revolutionary kind of comes out of it. I think that's probably pretty rare. And I feel like it's like the career of someone, I think like a Spike Lee, who's really interested in popular culture and was very much of his moment, and the way that he wanted to be part of that marketplace, but then it's really hard to find that place because, as you say, like it is kind of organized around a white imagination and we also have, there's like a role to play to kind of be in that marketplace in a successful way. But someone like Everson, I mean, he's an art museum filmmaker. He's an experimental filmmaker. Quentin Tarantino, other people, they're just doing something very different. But the forum is, I think, but the forum of the film, and any of these films, I think really opens that up, and I think that's what's important about them. Do you know what I mean? But I also have very few illusions about my own revolutionary tendencies. I'm just a person. And I think, I don't know, but I think that the way to think about P.T. Barnum, the way to think about Quentin Tarantino is as a kind of circus barker. And to think about the roots of popular culture as spectacle, as showcase, as physical, and that there's no way around its vileness. There's no way around kind of what it is except to not be interested in that. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know. So just kind of like all films aren't the same. My own films, I'm not as interested in thinking about like why Quentin Tarantino does what he does, because who can know what's in the mind of someone like that? I kind of just look at the thing, which I do take seriously, but not that seriously, because it's the circus. I look at it, I move on, and I wish other spectators would do that too. I'm really troubled that spectators are not skeptical enough, and that this is like our way into history, our way into the past, and our only sort of way of thinking about who we are. I think that's really troubling, and I feel like that relationship has to be severed. Even with, Kevin's like beautiful, those films are constructed, they're made to look real, they're not real. I don't know, or anybody's films, Spike Lee wants us to wake up and go out into the world, not stay in the theater, like watching his movies, and I think that's like the conversation, I feel like that's the conversation I feel like is most urgent, is less like what the film means. I am excited about talking about what the film means, but also like just what it can't possibly ever mean, and that there's other work that we have to do as people, do you know what I mean, that it can't really ever do for us. I don't know, I have very modest ways of thinking about what I do.
Thinking about that, part of me, to my chagrin, I kind of respond positively to Tarantino's films. I tend to enjoy them, but part of me thinks that the audience itself is kind of incapable of not responding to it in a carnival way. We see a historical film and we put it in the narrative construction that we'll absorb over and over and over again as we consume media, with revenge fantasies, with individual action rather than collective action. We can't absorb a movie that has collective action. We would force upon the narrative structure that had a Django-esque character kicking ass and fulfilling our revenge fantasies. I wonder if the audience just is not capable in the contemporary media state to not respond in the way that Quentin Tarantino imagines us responding.
But they never were.
Yeah.
They never were. The films have always been organized around a hero or a heroine or an anti-hero in the case of film noir, and it's always pointed toward the spectator to make the spectator feel like he or she is number one and is the only person in the theater. There are interventions. Charles Burnett in the LA Rebellion, pick any Spike Lee joint, any Italian neorealist film. There are interventions, but the Hollywood film is about me being in the center and everything's organized around my pleasure.
I remember seeing Malcolm X when it first came out and being a little bit disturbed because the audience was obviously responding very positively to the scenes that in the autobiography were examples of Malcolm's depravity before his awakening. And during those scenes of his depravity, the audience was responding very positively to those very disturbing images and thinking the same thing. That's the way we're processing even a Spike Lee film.
I know I'm talking too much, but I just saw something yesterday that reminds me of what we're talking about. different topic. You know, the show Mad Men or whatever that's on. You don't have time to watch TV, but the show's on, and the lead character is called Don, and he's a terrible person. You know, just like completely self-involved and mean, and he cheats on his wife, or both of the wives, and you know, he's just a terrible person. And so the actor who plays him, John Hamm, was on a talk show yesterday, and the person interviewing him said, you know, this character is so terrible. Like, why is he so likable? And so John Hamm's like, he's not likable. He's watchable, but he's not likable. And I feel like that's the conversation that needs to happen. Is like, you're watching something, and I think that we do have to be sensitive to the ways in which we then like sort of absorb these values that we're watching. But I feel like the people who create this stuff have a very different relationship to what they're watching. And it was kind of frustrating that I didn't stay to watch it, but from that moment the host like couldn't really process this idea that you're watching it because it's a spectacle, because of how he looks, the clothing, all of that like sucks you into this horrible world where they're selling like, you know, guns and cigarettes to kids or whatever, you know, advertising. And but it doesn't mean that you have to agree with it, or that you are agreeing with it, right? But that those things are really different. Although maybe for her she does like that. I don't know.
Can I take two questions? Elon and then you, sir.
So one of the reasons why I was so excited that we were going to get to do the screening here was because I knew that Django would be one of those movies that would get people talking. And I knew that before I even saw it. When I watched every commercial, every teaser that they had over and over and over again. There was nothing in those commercials that said, no one's going to see this. They're going to think it's boring, they're not going to go. Unfortunately, that's not how most films about slavery are marketed. No one wants to see these films, which frustrates me. And last semester I put together a long list of about 60 different English language films about slavery. And most people haven't seen the majority of them. I hadn't even heard of the majority of them. And that's because there's no Quentin Tarantino behind it. There's no famous actors. I don't want him doing another one, probably. But I guess my point is that I went into the movie after having seen at least clips of most of these 60 movies, and I'd actually watched the whole way through most of them, thinking that this is a really great movie. And I actually really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great popcorn film. My problem with it is that I study slavery all day, and I've seen all the other movies. I've seen hundreds of documentaries about slavery. That's not the perspective of the average person in the audience. And so when I would go and I would take my friends, because I've now seen the movie 3 times, when I would go and take my friends, I find myself constantly going, okay, you know that part's not true. Okay, well, you know KKK came later. Okay, you know, and then giving them all this extra facts, and then people asking me all these questions and realizing that, yeah, the regular audience doesn't have the background to look at this movie and say, this is not what reality was like. Or even, sometimes even separate the subtle things in the film that, you know, what was real and what was fiction. So I'm happy that it's gotten people talking about slavery, because no one really wanted to talk about it before the movie came out. But it is still problematic because it continues to put out there all these stereotypical images that are not based in the actual reality.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to follow on that. I think that whether we like it or not, we have to take seriously its kind of role as public pedagogy, you know, considering we learn about slavery in certain places in school, maybe some field trips, maybe on TV once in a while, but this probably represents a major site of representation of slavery for a lot of people. So I think it's worth just sort of talking about what image, you know, considering any movie has to be selective in what it shows, you know, I think it's worth talking about what it does show and what it doesn't show. I thought it was interesting to see what I thought were kind of echoes of Walter Johnson, the dogs, you know, these kind of like, I mean, to your point, there's not a lot of that kind of micro resistance, but there are, like, you do come away with this very clear sense that there were terrifying things happening, and to me I was like, okay, that helps me and maybe some other people sort of understand some of the kind of implicit violence that was going on every day. Anyway, that's just my question actually was about that scene, that dinner scene. So I was, for a really specific reason, I was really interested in that kind of phrenology speech. And I looked up the script, a PDF of the script. Some version of it didn't have that particular monologue in it. Didn't have taking the skull of old Ben and cutting it open and doing that whole thing. As soon as they discovered that they were, traitor, whatever, that they had come to for different reasons that they announced, he sort of came in with the shotgun right away in the original script. So it got me thinking, why do we think Tarantino might have put that in? What does it do with the rest of the script? And what is it trying to do? In that it's text. That's just something we hear, and how does it relate to what we see?
And I think structurally in that particular scene, it also helps to give King Schultz time to evolve himself, right? That there are clips back and forth, his own eyes and his own physical. Two characters evolved in that film, and neither of them, one is not Calvin Candy, who is as two-dimensional as Django, so the slaveholder and the slave remain roughly static to a certain extent. But King Schultz himself, his conscience has been awakened by the killing of the slave with the dog, and it's that speech, during that speech, I think that you start to see a focus in his eyes sort of tightening and gripping shut. He's having memories, as I recall, of the slave being killed by the dog. And it may well be that Tarantino just structurally wanted to attenuate that scene so that awakening could take place over a longer period of time. But I also just feel it's exactly the kind of show-offy, obscure historical reference that Tarantino loves to throw in there. Like that, maybe Walter Johnson and 700 people, all of whom are historians of slavery, recognized the footprint of Knott and Glidden in that particular scene, and the rest of us just thought, oh, that was really weird. People actually think that stuff, like how strange that is.
I think it was improvised. I think DiCaprio improvised.
I know that he cut his hand during so that they did it extended, and that he had cut his hand and the blood is real, so it's his actual blood. It was all done in one take. They didn't rough cut it, so it may well be an improvisational.
Yeah, I remember him saying that in an interview. It just came back to me because you were talking about it. But then, of course, it still functions in this really curious way that the two of you are talking about.
I mean, you got to build the tension of the evil character. He moves from the cartoonish character to evil once you have the knowledge with Samuel L. Jackson's character. So it's a technique. It's a filmic technique to actually change the character from cartoonish to actually evil, to understand that this is the evil of slavery, and this is the evil of Candyland, and this is the evil of what he's doing. So you actually have to begin to have this is a transformation of that character from the cartoon to the evil villain, and then you build the tension scene, and of course you can come in. But getting back to, that's one way of thinking about it. Getting back to the point about the conversation, people are always talking about slavery. It depends on how we construct public discourse. If public discourse is constructed around what we may think of in mass media, and then that becomes the absolute form for public discourse, we actually miss what's actually going on the ground any every day. So if you look at what goes on in local museums, historical societies, every day, every month, plantation tours in the South, what you look at is at Monticello, people are talking about slavery every day. So if we mistake that, if we mistake what's going on the ground for then what has a certain type of media capital that's capitalized for a week or so. I mean, that's when you get these flurry of emails. And then, of course, it subsides to the new thing that comes along. I mean, always the fetish of the new at the national. Then we actually underestimate what's going on in the mind of filmmakers, in the mind of the audience. And I think people pick up on phonology because this is sort of everyday knowledge of how people think of racial difference. So when you think of racial difference as being biological, and then of course we can get all these surveys around the country that people believe that race is biological, then we realize that, people have this already in their minds, and this reaffirms what they already have in their minds, and we're actually getting the post hoc effect of what's going on. So I think we have to then calibrate or develop a scalar logic around what's going on in terms of the public, because I think I told a reporter around here for the Providence. There it is. I said, look, there's an article with Horace Mann Bond talking about Brown needing to establish a program in Black studies because of its institutional ties to slavery as early as 1968. And I sent the article to him, and I said, people know this. It depends on, we can never underestimate who we are. And when we think that we have a particular knowledge, everyday people also have a particular knowledge. And that knowledge is as sophisticated as the knowledge we find in the academy. So I never underestimate the audience. I mean, this is the one thing Kevin and I, when we made our two films, never underestimate the audience. They always know. And they're more sophisticated than our conversation.
Hands off, line up. Yes, sir. And then, yes, ma'am. Do two at a time. Two at a time.
I appreciate your statements on several things, especially on the dinner sequence and that interaction between Django and Steve, whatever his name was. And so one of the things that I noticed when watching it last night was it was really more about Django rather than on a commentary of slavery in general, because when I wanted to see what was going on in the far reaches of the wide shots of the plantations, we were never really given that insight into what was really going on until you finally get to the dinner scene, when Samuel L. Jackson is going into the back. And I kind of had that same disappreciation of the movie Lincoln, which you've also mentioned, because when you're looking for a really palpable vision of just something to put to what you've read, I found lacking. And my question is, what are your opinions on Lincoln, considering they're both in the same kind of genre and at the same releasing point?
Second question, and then we ask. Yes.
Actually, a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really like the movie either, but I thought to myself, why did he use like comic relief to actually draw the audience to actually go watch the movie? We find that a lot of people do not take time. Just like you said, a lot of people don't watch the serious stuff about slavery. So I'm thinking maybe he said, let me do something comical to actually represent the society, who we are right now. We're very ignorant. We don't take time to go and actually get the facts. So when we go out there and watch the film, a film that's very comical, that sort of misrepresents what's going on out there, then probably it will, now that he said the audience is not stupid, right? It creates doubt within the audience, and the audience goes out there to find exactly what they need to find out. But at the same time, you realize that it's a movie that depicts very gross scenes, like the killing of the slave people. But at the same time, a lot of people laughed when that was happening. Like, we laughed at all the shootings, and we go like, shoot that, like shoot him. It actually represents probably who we really are. And but we can go as far as laughing and celebrating at violence, even if it's well-intentioned, because these are people who are killing kids, so they need their revenge. If we can go as far as laughing at that, then that depicts who or what the society really is. Yeah, something like that.
Okay, great, thanks. can get a response to yours, please, and then I come to you, sir.
Response.
The response to your from the panel. Response to your
What's on Lincoln?
Lincoln.
It's an don't go to Lincoln to learn about Lincoln. Go to see the performance of Daniel Day-Lewis as Lincoln and to reflect on how he inhabits him. But there are better ways to learn about Lincoln and to connect to what you've read and let what you've read be sufficient. This relationship to movies as real has to be torn apart. It has to be torn apart in order to see them for what they are and then to actually learn something.
Okay. 1, 2.
So I actually might disagree with many people here. I really like the movie. I know it could be just a fictional movie, like a Hollywood film. However, it did really, I think, open a discussion about slavery and the history of this country. And I was so shocked when I saw, like the black people, torturing each other, and how Samuel Jackson, he was, doing everything to try to please the white man. So I felt that it's a really good movie. My question, such movies and documentaries about the whole history of slavery in this country, do you think that this could affect the African American people here? To in what way basically? Would that make them feel they're having more hatred to the white people, or probably have a better understanding of their history and to let the other people here in this country know about that? I'm just wondering what effect would such movies and all this have on the African American people.
Okay. Michael?
Just a quick question of just the relationship of how we're to study slavery, because I find Monticello even more absurd than Django Unchained, right? And because I've been there 4 or 5 times, right? I walked through there, and I know for a fact that I feel that this is even more unrealistic in a lot of ways than Django Unchained could possibly be, right? So I'm just wondering how the relationship of how we're to study. If we're talking about hyperrealism, we actually have to create a plantation, right? And we have to go there and see and observe this at some level. That's never going to happen. So it seems to me that there's no way. There's always going to be some distance, right? And this distance is what we're talking about, the distance that makes legible these interactions. And I find a real space like Monticello to be even sillier than Django Unchained.
Okay, 2 questions. Yeah. Anybody from the panel?
I think it's interesting to think about Monticello and Django being versions of the same. That if Django is a circus, then Monticello is a theme park. I mean, they're both variants of places where you pay for admission and you get a ride, essentially. Neither one of them is meant to be historically accurate. What troubles me about Django and about Monticello and Colonial Williamsburg and the plantation museums is that, so we have a circus with a big ringleader, P.T. Barnum. Why do we need circuses? And what role do our circuses play? What kind of work do they do in our society? And how should we feel about that work? And what, if we didn't have circuses, what would the world be like? And I feel like, P.T. Barnum was a fairly, I think Tarantino would love to be called P.T. Barnum of this
I
moment,
give
which
him
is,
the satisfaction.
no, let's not let it appear in print, please. But, I think P.T. Barnum was a kind of touchstone for his particular moment, and not always a good one, like a really complicated, problematic, challenging one, not just in terms of pushing the audience to respond in a way, but as an example of a 19th century that was really dark and disturbing and weird and strange. So if Quentin Tarantino is our P.T. Barnum, it says really, for me, frightening and terrifying things about the world we presently live in. Right? It makes me think that the circus we want is not the circus I thought we wanted. That would be my thoughts, randomly distributed.
Shifting reality to dead. I mean, this is bizarre. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, look at this. I mean, we saw a movie yesterday, or there was a screening yesterday, and now we were talking about a movie today. This whole, I mean, if we reduce it to that level without understanding the categorical formations of what Monticello means and what a film means, then we can actually run that reductionist logic down, and we can say, look, everything becomes this circle, this circus, or this convalescent atmosphere, or this theme park. But we can't do that. I mean, we make particular delineations around logic and around particular formations, and the absurdity of Monticello is not of the same categorical absurdity of the film, where we're looking at absurdity as a categorical frame of an aesthetic strategy, not absurdity as illogic. Both of them have a particular logical structure. So I don't want to run the reductionist road of saying that they inhabit the same level of absurdity. They just don't. The question becomes where individuals are gaining their formations of knowledge. And both of them serve as particular forms for knowledge, Monticello and Django. What we can't do is then reduce those inhabitants of both of those spaces as tabula rasa, or not understanding or not bringing in particular epistemic structures to understand what they're going to see and how they're going to integrate it within their particular theories of knowledge. To your question around how African Americans feel, this isn't about African Americans. As I stated before, this is about the white imagination. So the question has to be actually reflected back on whites. How do white people feel? And why do white people have this preoccupation with the black figure in film, and then move that to a certain level of reality, from film to reality, as to what black people, how do African Americans feel? I want to know, do films make white people less anti-black racist? If they don't do that, then, I ain't got time to sit up here, to translate film for white people. This is just not my job. So we really have to begin to understand that particular logic. And this is what Django does. There's a preoccupation with the black figure throughout Quentin Tarantino's entire filmic oeuvre that we begin to unravel. And it really came to me when both characters, King Schultz played the German Nazi in *Inglourious Bastards*, and King Schultz in Django Unchained, and began to think through what is the preoccupation of Quentin Tarantino with Germans, for one thing. And the actual, I'm thinking of the Moravians in North Carolina, and I don't want to do the historical analog, because then I'm getting to the Moravians in North Carolina and what they were doing. But that's not it. I'm preoccupied with the ways in which he's thinking about a particular German aesthetic. This would be, what is the role of the German that can usurp the European and cowboys and Europeans about spaghetti westerns? What do the Germans? How do the Germans fit in Quentin Tarantino's imagination? Ideally, this is really about the fixation and the fetish of the black and the white imagination. And so, what does this film tell us about the white imagination? It's kind of like the question around black popular music, around hip hop. It's not telling us, it ain't giving us a lot about depth about black folks, but it gives us a lot of data about how whites want to consume black people, and in what ways they want to consume black people. And the ways in which you feel comfortable, white people feel comfortable in the consumption of black folk. And that's good. That's a conversation we can have. But if we, I don't want to run the relativist road to say that spaces of film, that we have this absolute logic around film and particular spaces that are doing quite different things, that we then have to be attentive to, and how we're using particular categorical formulas. Because when you go to Monticello, that's off the chain. Monticello is truly a world that, we can't imagine it. But like Ellison said, on a deeper level, it is us. That's the scary part.
But I mean, but isn't that the problem with Monticello? I'm saying that because we pretend like, I mean, the danger here is like being careful not to take Django Unchained as an historical representation. The danger to me seems to be to take Monticello as an historical representation, right?
I'm not making that argument.
I'm saying it's the same conversation because what is the Jefferson Historical Society trying to pull, right?
Well, that's
same
it.
thing
What
that-
is Hollywood trying to pull?
Right, they're both trying to pull
It's
something.
derivative.
Right,
So
so
it
same
is the particular
categorical.
logic of capital now. This is the particular, I mean, the same thing when we have Colonial Williamsburg.
Right.
When it's made in the 1920s. It's a derivative logic. It wants to create the real. But the creation of the real is predicated on the ideal and what they can actually function. This is a Richard Handler's a wonderful book on museums and his study of Colonial Williamsburg. I mean, when Richard did that, we can do that with a whole host of sites. But we understand as scholars, then we say, you know, this is the derivative value always gestures to the real. So when the beautiful C.L.R. James quote that Professor Bogues opened up with reminds us that these particular forms are always contextual and they derive their value not from the form itself. James is the ultimate materialist, the ultimate concrete thinker. So we have to begin to understand how these forms move across space and time relative to what's going on in society. So these are the forms. Django is the form, Monticello is the form, but we do not equate the filmic form with the same form as this particular museum. We understand how these structures are operating, and particularly Django at this moment, what it means within the larger context of American media culture, and particularly visual culture, the hegemony of the visual in our particular moment. That if we don't see it, it doesn't exist.
Go ahead.
I have some things to say.
No, go
I'll
ahead.
just be brief. I don't want to be I'm not the lame historian in the room who, although I sometimes play that role, who constantly says this is not factually accurate or this is not exactly the way it should be. But I do think it's important to recognize for all of these things, for Monticello, for Django, the power of what Tony said at the very start of this is that once something like this is released into the wild, it becomes a thing unto itself. And it can be owned by anyone and repurposed for anything. And the truth is, no matter how we feel about ourselves here, this is a historically uneducated nation, right? That we are nationally illiterate about the basic facts of history, that we know very little about our own history, about world history, about the history of slavery. And so we here are sitting and having what is a fairly abstract and highbrow conversation about whether phrenology is the most accurate way to depict conversations about slavery in the 19th century, when your garden variety person is probably going to YouTube that particular dinner scene clip somewhere in the middle of Indiana from whence I came here, right? And absorb that as if it were the gospel truth about the history of slavery. And that worries me as much as does the practice of visiting Monticello and absorbing the truth of this place. That
Or someone may baptize it in the medical school and think that race is real.
I don't want us. I don't want us to distract. I don't want that to distract us. I just think it's important. You know, these disciplinary prerogatives and institutional prerogatives about the protection of knowledge. Right. This is a knowledge production industry we're in, and we're making knowledge. We're attempting to produce an enlightened citizenry. We're educating people to make a difference in the world. We're educating ourselves in conversation with students and peers. And outside this world, there's a universe of people who absorb material in a very different way and who will encounter this film now that it's been released into the wild and learn the truth about slavery as it's understood by Quentin Tarantino.
Terry, you've been.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why our public voices are so important, right? That we need to be writing for a broader public beyond our students and colleagues. I guess what I was thinking about was actually that the C.L.R. James quote isn't about context. It's about when these things go out into the world and become part of conversations, that they do become something else and something quite unpredictable. I think that's the important term to me there is the something else. And that he doesn't say what it becomes, and we don't know what it becomes, and it becomes a lot of different things to different people. And I don't think that that's, I don't know, absurdity, I don't see how that's reductive, I guess because I am invested in it. I'm building my career on studying that. That is what I do as a film scholar. I don't try to get into filmmakers' minds about what they're doing because, you know, unless it's an interview and you're really trying to think about a particular kind of like production history or maybe a biographical reading of some type of film, I think that these things really, the nature of popular culture is that the objects do float unanchored. That's kind of what is troubling about it. I think is that we can't really control meaning, and probably as scholars, I think our job is to generate and control meaning, but it just doesn't operate that way. And so I actually think that a healthy sense of the ways in which these things, they're not, representation just doesn't seem adequate. Maybe refraction of reality, refraction of the past, gives us some way of seeing this object for what it is and thinking about its affect, because it's not only its context, it's its affect and the way that individuals and groups experience it, and being able to respect that experience and understand that experience as a way of unpacking what the thing is, whether it's this Monticello or, you know, or this movie, because I'm a very like strict format, like they're very different, and you couldn't really, you know, you'd have to really account for what it means to make a movie and what it means to create this kind of, I don't know, like historical theme park or a pageant or whatever it is. And then you'd have to really put that, you know, with what the makers think that they're up to. I think we always have to engage what they think that they're doing, you know, in like an honest way, you know, not like in a, like, you know, like a suspicious way, but just like take them at their word in a certain way. I really feel like that's important, and that the sense of, I don't know, I think the sense of the absurd, which is illogic. It's not, I don't think it's an escape from logic at all. I think it's a part of African American expression, like through literature, through music, through, you know, through visual art, and it's kind of I don't know, it's almost an old tradition. It's kind of the only way out, for a lot of artists. But that's different from people who are not performing and who are not artists, right? And who are not making anything up. When I saw this movie in the theaters, I mean, it was a pretty much an all-black audience, and they seemed to be really feeling it. What does that mean? Of course, I didn't interview them because you have to have like special things to be able to interview people sociologically. I don't know what people do in the other part of the college. But for dealing with things that are fake and things that are phony and things that are counterfeit, that's kind of what those are the tools that I have. And I think that it's kind of interesting, like what you said about like, people reacting to the, you know, like the guns of shooting and stuff like that. I mean, I don't know. I think it's probably both, that people are kind of fascinated with that type of darkness, right? And that is kind of part of who we are. But then it's also so cartoonish and so not real and not realistic. And maybe that's also part of the either a nervous laughter or an ironic laughter or some. I mean, there are a lot of different types of laughter that I think can be happening there. I know I'm always really disturbed, like when people are laughing at things that I don't think they should be laughing at. And this movie maybe is completely consists of those kinds of moments, but it also is what it is. And one of the things it is a kind of I don't know, this kind of like elastic, double kind of serious and not serious, real and not real, that I think is really constitutive of popular culture in the way that people are. And I guess it is kind of decadent, and it is, I don't know, because I feel like you're saying that it's also wrong, and I think it probably is wrong. And I think that is a part of us, is being wrong and not terribly revolutionary or great or morally good, and that's what gets acknowledged in the darkness of these types of these types of performances. And I don't know. I accept.
Can I take two more? Yes, please, ma'am.
I have a question about, so when the young man mentioned Lincoln, you said just take Lincoln as it is, and, you know, don't go to Lincoln for your information on Abraham Lincoln. So why not just take Django as this film and see it or not, and don't go to Django or Tarantino for slavery information? But how, my question is, do we hold him accountable for what he's putting out there? Like we're held accountable as academics for what we put out. We have a standard and we have peer reviewed, and I mean I don't think Spike Lee is considered his peer, but I mean anyway, I'm not gonna go to Spike. But do we hold him accountable for what they're putting out? Because at face value, it's art, and it is what it is, and you leave it at that. You choose to see it or you don't. But the fact that we're having this conversation about it, we're taking it to a level that he wasn't trying to go to. So,
can say,
but do we just leave it there and leave it for them, for the common people, or do we have our conversations about it?
No, I think we have to be really flexible about it. I think that on the one hand, you see it for what it is, but your reaction to it, your experience of it is really important. I think this conversation is really important and really interesting. And because it's an example of the ways that movies do create these forums for community, that it is a part of civil society. Yes, it's a product that's there to make money. I mean, so are my jeans, but they also have other purposes too. You know, I like the color, whatever. I have, there are these other kind of dimensions to it that are stupid, that are superficial, that are emotional, that are temporary, that are permanent. You know what I mean? And so I think that we have to be able to, on the one hand, yes, you see it for what it is, see it or not see it, but as a way, I think, to liberate ourselves, to have a conversation amongst ourselves. We don't really need QT to have this conversation, right? This is something that we can do ourselves. This is the wake up moment. But I mean, I'm interested in like what you're saying about the accountability of Quentin Tarantino, and I think I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to have that conversation, directly with him. I think that's part of our conversation in discussing him from a number of him and his work from a number of different perspectives. As many as those of us who've seen it and who want to talk about it. But all he's going to do is say he's going to be Teflon about it. It's going to be so frustrating and so unproductive to address him directly that I wouldn't even take him that seriously directly. Do you know what I mean? Because he's at work, he's selling, and he's gonna say something more annoying, more insulting. I mean, if you've seen the interviews with him, I mean, he's just insufferable. You can't talk to him, but we can talk to each other. And I think that's where it's at, I think, for these movies.
Can I take Charlie in the back, please?
Yeah.
You haven't spoken yet, so I'm taking it.
I'm sorry?
No, I said you haven't spoken yet.
No, I was listening to the conversation. I think that you have to separate how the public views movies and how people in the academy view movies. Further, when it comes to the public, I think you have to separate how the black public approaches movies and the white public approaches movies. And I think there is some greatness and overlap, but as somebody who went to the movies, lived in an all black, segregated community with black movie theaters, and watched the popularity of Clint Eastwood, Bruce Lee, Fred the Hammer Williamson, Jim Brown, or the popularity of Melvin Van Peebles as Sweetback's badass. I mean, bad Negroes, dangerous Negroes, always are popular in black public culture. That's a fact. They like people view those movies that way. And I think sociologists or psychologists could come up with all kinds of complicated intellectual reasons as to why that's so. I can tell you what I observed. Black public likes that. And so if I went to see Django, I live in Jacksonville, Florida. I was in the movies. It was practically all black. And every time Jamie Foxx killed a white man, beat a white man, the theater was yes. You know, and I think there are reasons for that. But Hollywood recognizes this. Professor Walker is right. They make movies to make money. And they recognize this kind of popularity in the public. They don't go any further than that. I am pessimistic about the prospects of changing that, especially since movies really in Hollywood are driven by the auteurs, right? I mean, that's really who makes the decisions about movies more than the writers and more than even some of the most popular actors. But I'm pessimistic about the prospects of changing that. The only way you change that is if you make your own movies the way you want the movies to be. And that sets up a whole bunch of other kinds of problems that range from money to consciousness. But I don't see Hollywood changing its ways. They don't care about the accuracy of history, whether it's Henry Fonda playing Abraham Lincoln or Jamie Foxx playing Django. They're not interested in the accuracy. They're not interested in educating people into history. That's not their business. And I think Professor Walker, and I didn't mean to talk so long, is right on one other point. I think the more interesting discussion in respect to Django is, what do we learn about white people watching this movie?
If I could just say this one thing, I think our relationship to studying these images has for a long time been to critique the image, right? Like the NAACP having meetings with Hollywood executives in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And that has not worked, because they can always say, this is so much better, this is progressive, because of whoever, because of Sidney Poitier's character or something. And then whoever the representatives are of the Black community, whether it's the NAACP or some other kind of cultural minority, ethnic minority, like accepts that in a way. But nobody addresses the actual structure of films and what they are. That they are products. They've never been anything but that. I mean, GE sells refrigerators, Disney sells refrigerators, and they also sell movies. They don't really think about it. That's who runs it. They don't think about it any other way. They think about who the audience is, who has money, who has money, who will spend money to go to the movies just as entertainment. That's who movies are for, and that's the reality. But I don't think that precludes other experiences from happening. So that in the theater, audiences, even though, yes, they're scamming me by bringing me to this theater, but the connection that I might feel in thinking about Jamie Foxx, or that other folks did, or the people at the Jacksonville Theater feel, I think that's really important, and it has a life of its own. And that I don't think we don't need to take those things apart. But I think if we're going to be critical of movies, we do need to see that the image and what's on screen is just part of the story. It's not the whole story, and it is just a thing, that we can move on from, even if we experience it in troubling or deep ways or fun ways or whatever, and I think that's part of human experience, right? It's like, whatever the structure is doing, I do have a life and thoughts, and experiences. And I think it's the same with movie going, but you have to be able to move between, all those different spheres.
I want to stop the discussion because people are thinning out. If I could just end with a few words. Jimmy Baldwin once said, when he was asked about a particular novel, and writer, he said, I don't tell another artist what to write. And I would never tell another artist what to write. But he also went on to say that doesn't mean when he writes what he does or she does that I don't have something to say. Right? And I think what we're trying to do here is not saying to people what you should do and what you should not do. You don't have that power at all. Even if we did, I'm not sure one would want to exercise it at all. But that what we're trying to do is to think about what happens when somebody does something and it's out there for the public. And we need to begin to think about what that means when something is out there for the public. What happens when a particular, when Hollywood director attempts to do parody but really does excess? And what's the difference between excess and a set of parodies? I'm not now talking as a scholar, talking about just as someone watching a movie. What's the set of differences when excess becomes the order? And how does excess, if you wish, connect to questions of affect? And in connecting to questions of affect, what really stories are being told? Because I would agree with you that everything is not just the image, but the question of movies in the 21st century, in a century in which the image and the visual is dominant, is that it tells us set of stories, that there is a way in which knowledge is actually being produced on that screen, whether we like it or whether we don't like it. Now, as a historian or as a critical theorist, and I say, oh my God, I might hold on my head and say, gee, Christ almighty God, how could they do that? But that there is a way, and I think Matt is right, there is a way in which there is a illiteracy that then gets feed into museums and into films. In other words, that the vast majority of people do not go to the history books to get and what we write. You sell 1,000 copies, you think you're doing well. But the vast majority of people get their history from museums, and the vast majority of people get their history or their understanding of history from movies. Now, the question is, or the one issue that Terry raises, okay, how do you untether that? How do you see something just as entertainment and not history? How do you see a story as, oh, let me go in there for a popcorn moment, and then everything is, it's just a popcorn moment, and then when I come out there, that's it. I'm not sure it is easy to untether, because there's a way in which questions of the visual and the image and ways of seeing are also ways of knowing. And therefore, there is a larger question, I think, that one needs to address, which is, what is the role of the industry of cinema in a certain kind of reproduction of a certain kind of knowledge? Right? Or the old question of ideology. It's an old question. It's not a new question. Right? And therefore, it would seem to me that one has to think through these questions of the cinema, not in any kind of highfalutin, but think through the questions of the cinema and its role and of image and of the stories that these images tell, and its relationship to questions of reproduction at a specific moment. And what then does it tell us about the politics of at a specific moment? I'll just end with one story, because I think Hollywood has a really important role to play in the reproduction of desire and imagination in this country. This is the dream machine, not Hollywood. The country is the dream machine, and Hollywood is the most sophisticated of the dream machines. It's not just derivative, I think. It is a certain kind of dream and desire which it actually manufactures. And I will just end with one story to show what I mean. The person who did How Did They Come, Perry Hensel, and myself, lived together for 8 months to write a script on Marcus Garvey. We then came to New York and LA to shop it. He had connections because of his work in How Did They Come. Everybody we went on, names I will not mention, said, oh, this is a great script. Where's the white woman? We said, we can't put a white woman inside there, because Garvey had no relationship with a white woman, another one that he had when he was 8 years old with the lady, his neighbor in St. Anne. There's nobody else. You cannot, this movie will not sell if there's no white woman in it. The movie has not been made. I think we can end on that.